President Lincoln's actions during the Civil War and President Roosevelt's actions during World War II represented high watermarks, perhaps at times flood stages, in the exercise of presidential power during wartime. As we saw in Unit 7, the court articulated some important limiting principles in the Youngstown case in response to President Truman's steel seizure during the Korean War, and after the Vietnam War, Congress attempted to restrain executive action absent a congressional declaration of war through the War Powers Resolution, a statute that was circumvented by President Clinton in the Yugoslavian conflict. The 9/11 attacks presented a legal conundrum because they were perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, a terrorist group, not by a nation-state. The modern international law of war began to take shape after the European wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries, along with the very concept of independent sovereign nation-states. It anticipates organized national armies in uniforms facing off on defined battlefields, not transnational terror groups bound by ideology without a specific national identity that might or might not be supported by one or more nation-states. After the 9/11 attacks, the President and the Congress and much of the populace felt the need for a military response. But unlike the Pearl Harbor bombing in 1941, there was no nation-state against which war could be declared. Congress's solution was to issue a joint resolution titled the Authorization for Use of Military Force, or AUMF. The AUMF stated that the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future attacks of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. The AUMF also stated that it comprised a congressional authorization to enter into hostilities under the War Powers Resolution. Pursuant to the AUMF, President George W. Bush ordered the military to conduct operations against the Taliban in Afghanistan, which the U.S. believed was harboring al-Qaeda leaders, including the head of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. The Taliban is a Sunni Islamic fundamentalist political movement that controlled about 3/4 of the territory in Afghanistan at the time of the 9/11 attacks. The Taliban had seized this power at the conclusion of the Afghan Civil War in 1996, which began shortly after the Soviet-Afghan War. Several hundred foreign individuals alleged to be fighting on behalf of the Taliban and/or al-Qaeda were captured in the course of the Afghanistan campaign. This presented a legal conundrum. If these persons were civilians, they would be entitled to ordinary criminal process. This would be particularly problematic because the U.S. military had no authority to serve as a police force in Afghanistan or to forcibly extradite persons suspected of U.S. crimes for trial in the United States. If these persons were enemy combatants, the law of war would apply, and they would need to be held as prisoners of war and treated appropriately under the Geneva Conventions. This would also mean they could not be tried in a military tribunal. Meanwhile, the U.S. claimed that some of these individuals likely knew of further planned terrorist attacks by al-Qaeda or other groups against the United States. The U.S. government's solution was to confine these persons at the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Further, the U.S. treated those held at Guantanamo as unlawful combatants, meaning that they eventually could be subject to trial by military tribunal and were not entitled to habeas corpus. This meant that the U.S. could detain these prisoners indefinitely for interrogation purposes, sometimes using so-called enhanced interrogation techniques that human rights organizations consider torture, or try them for war crimes that could carry the death penalty. All of this, we should note, was aside from the U.S. holding some persons in black sites outside the United States or renditioning some prisoners to countries without strong civil rights protections that would cooperate with the U.S., also often for the purpose of enhanced interrogation or torture. The fact that the U.S. has a naval base in Cuba is itself a historical oddity. The U.S. military presence in Guantanamo Bay dates to the Spanish-American War in 1898. That conflict arose when the USS Maine, an armored cruiser, exploded and sank in the Havana harbor during Cuban revolts against Spanish rule. The slogan, "Remember the Maine," fed a war fervor that led to U.S. intervention in the Cuban War of Independence, ultimately establishing Cuba as a sovereign nation. The U.S. leased the Guantanamo base from Cuba starting in 1901, and that lease persisted even after the Cuban Socialist Revolution led by Fidel Castro recast Cuba as a communist nation. Civil rights organizations tried to file habeas corpus petitions on behalf of the Guantanamo detainees. The first of these cases to reach the Supreme Court were Rasool v. Bush and Hamdi v. Rumsfeld in 2004. Shafiq Rasool was a British man in his mid-20s who had traveled with two other young men from the British Midlands to Afghanistan in 2001. They came to be known as the Tipton Three after the town in the English Midlands where they lived. Although they admitted visiting a Taliban training camp where they handled AK-47 assault rifles, they claimed they went to Afghanistan to do charity work and only visited the training camp because they were stuck in Afghanistan. They were captured in Afghanistan in 2001 and detained by the U.S. military at Guantanamo Bay for 3 years. They claimed that while in detention, they were beaten, deprived of sleep, sexually humiliated, and abused because of their Muslim religion.
Basically, I spent just over two years in Guantanamo, and we went through a lot of experiences while we was there. It was a very hard time for us to go through.
Shafiq, you were there in Camp X-Ray, correct?
Yeah, we was one of the first ones to be in Camp X-Ray when it opened.
Could you describe Camp X-Ray for the audience here?
Basically, the only way to describe it is like a zoo. You're just kept in cages 24 hours a day, and the guards watch you 24 hours, and you're not allowed to even lie down at certain times of the day. We had to sit during the morning time. We had to sit up in our cells, face one direction, and we couldn't move. They wouldn't. In the beginning, they wouldn't even let us pray.
How many people were in Camp X-Ray at that time, as best you could tell?
About 300, 200. I think there's between 200 and 300 people there.
You may recall that you and I had a discussion about an incident involving Juma, the client I just talked about, that you witnessed in Camp X-Ray.
Yeah.
Could you describe that for us?
Basically, there was 8 guys that came into his cell, and he was already lying down in his cell when they came in. And basically, when you're lying down in your cell, from what we were told, that all they have to do is shackle you up and take you out. And what happened with him was, basically, the 8 guys ran into his cell, and the first guy just did a knee drop on his back, and I think he broke his nose. And then there was the other 7 soldiers came running into his cell and started kicking him and punching him. And initially we heard Juma scream, then after that we didn't hear anything, and we thought he had died. And then the block guard told this female guard to go into his cell and basically kick him in the stomach, and he's got a lot of stomach problems from what I've found out later. And she was kicking him in the stomach violently, and then they took him out, and we didn't see him for a while, so we didn't know what happened to him. And after a few days, we got moved to Camp Delta, and that was the next time I met him, and he had his face was all bruised up, blood, he had the same clothes on that he'd been wearing when he was beaten, and they were basically covered in blood.
Shafiq Rasool and other Guantanamo detainees, supported by various civil rights organizations, filed petitions for habeas corpus in the U.S. federal court. The government argued that Einsteiger controlled, because the men had been captured on foreign soil and the U.S. base at Guantanamo Bay, where they were detained, was in Cuba, not in the United States. Indeed, this was an important reason why the Guantanamo base was selected as the detention facility for such detainees after 9/11. The federal habeas corpus statute stated that writs of habeas corpus may be granted by the district courts within their respective jurisdictions in favor of a person in custody in violation of the Constitution or laws or treaties of the United States. The government hoped that holding the detainees at Guantanamo rather than on U.S. soil would preclude access to habeas corpus under the statute. The court disagreed. Writing for the majority, Justice Stevens noted that the Guantanamo detainees were not nationals of countries at war with the United States, denied the claim that they were terrorists, had never been tried for any crime nor even charged with any wrongdoing, and that the U.S. exercises exclusive jurisdiction and control over the Guantanamo base even though it is located in Cuba. Under these circumstances, the court held, a federal district court has jurisdiction to hear a habeas petition. Justice Scalia, Rehnquist, and Thomas dissented, arguing that the court effectively overruled Einsteiger.